Hey everyone, What If Fan here, bringing you another exciting part of What If Transmigrated in Bleach World. You can find the fanfic title and the original author's name on my Patreon page. Make sure to check it out and show them some love. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Also check out my Patreon channel for early releases of all the series, where you can find all the series released one day ahead of YouTube. Alright, let's jump into it. Chapter 171. Could I have fallen into Lord Aizen's Kyokusuagetsu? Am I simply hallucinating? Who could possibly unleash such an attack? What kind of monster are we facing? Are you serious? That power obscuring the sky was actually Ryatsu? That's impossible. It seems to be coming from a Shinigami. Are all Shinigami this terrifying? This is divine punishment. Divine punishment? Perhaps you're right. Feeling the overwhelming spiritual pressure washing over her, Tear Harabel, not particularly talkative under normal circumstances, grew even more withdrawn. Before Aizen's arrival in Hueco Mundo, the Hollows had never believed in any concept of gods. Even if deities truly existed somewhere in the universe, Hueco Mundo and its hollow inhabitants had clearly been abandoned by them. This realm knew only killing, bloodshed, and fear. No salvation or hope existed here. Certainly no benevolent gods watching over them. But when Aizen arrived, everything changed. Suddenly, there were gods. This extraordinarily powerful Shinigami had brought the Hogyoku, which offered both hope and light to their dark world. The process of Arankarization allowed countless Hollows to escape the terrifying cycle of degeneration while simultaneously granting them unprecedented power. For these transformed beings, such power could only be described as divine. But today, facing the pillar of light that pierced the sky and the golden sun that seemed to pass judgment on the sins of Hueco Mundo, Harabel found herself deeply confused. If they were to consider this power spreading throughout Hueco Mundo and intimidating all living creatures as belonging to an existence on the same level as themselves, it wouldn't merely be arrogance or overestimation of their capabilities. It would be pure delusion. Anyone with even minimal intelligence could recognize that this power operated on an entirely different tier than their own. Confronted with such overwhelming might, even someone with Harabel's unwavering conviction couldn't help but experience moments of doubt. But soon enough, she shook her head and reaffirmed her faith. They had no path of retreat available to them. Regardless of the challenges ahead, Aizen had brought hope to Hueco Mundo and to all Arrancar. So whether they ultimately triumphed or failed, they could only follow Aizen to the very end. Even if it meant facing such a terrifying enemy, she would not back down. Because Harabel genuinely yearned for the arrival of a world without needless sacrifice, exactly as Aizen had promised. Like Harabel, when the attack first manifested, the Primera Espada Stark and the Segunda Espada Barragan used their considerable Ryatsu to shield their respective fraction. Because of their immense power and considerable distance from Uehara Shiroa, and because they weren't primary targets of his focused attack, they managed to preserve most of their strength. Even Yami, once ranked 10th Espada, protected his canine companion. The innocent-looking dog Hollow was actually his loyal fraction. The man and dog shared a surprisingly close bond, seemingly dependent on each other despite Yami's brutish nature. The Espada of Hueco Mundo were, in many ways, just workers. Though they wore pristine white uniforms and resided in the Palatial Las Noches, these privileges were all granted by Aizen. For Yami, even being able to keep a pet represented a luxury. The Cuarta Espada, Oquiora, remained isolated in another dimension. Furthermore, he had no fraction to protect. While most Espada remained numb with shock, the uniquely powerful Primera Espada Stark and the historically significant Segunda Espada Barragan began forming their own assessments of the situation. In Coyote Stark's quarters, his fraction Lilynette, having escaped the worst of the devastating spiritual pressure, shouted at her master. "Stark, snap out of it. How do you expect to defeat someone like that if you remain so listless? Didn't you feel that Ryatsu? This is no ordinary enemy we're facing." As Stark's fraction and spiritual other half, she complimented him in fundamental ways. Their complementary nature extended beyond gender to encompass personality as well. Where Stark appeared perpetually exhausted, his demeanor lazy and detached, as though nothing in existence could possibly matter to him. Lilynette radiated energy and enthusiasm, competitive by nature and eager to prove herself. The two existed in perfect opposition yet harmonious balance. Stark complained with a sigh, "Why should I confront someone of such overwhelming strength? This isn't a conflict we should be involved in." Despite these words, doubt lingered in his heart. Aizen allowed such a formidable opponent to enter Hueco Mundo without issuing any warnings. This is highly irregular. Unlike the other Espada, Stark, possessing nearly unrivaled power himself, could better comprehend the true horror of the attack they had just witnessed. In his assessment, all Espada, himself included, would likely perish if they became enemies of this mysterious attacker. Moreover, Stark had experienced soul fragmentation, which had significantly reduced his former strength. Even at the peak of his power, he recognized no realistic possibility of victory against such an opponent. The mere thought of standing against someone of such overwhelming might filled Stark's heart with pessimism and despair. If given any choice in the matter, he would prefer not to become this person's enemy. For Stark, the ultimate outcome of this war held little importance. He cared nothing for the fate of worlds, harbored no inherent hostility toward Shinigami, and possessed no ambition for greater power. He simply wished to avoid the crushing solitude that had defined his existence. As a Vasto Lord with unparalleled hollow abilities, Stark's strength had always separated him from others. His Ryatsu had been so overwhelming that any hollow approaching him instantly perished. From the moment of his birth, he had known only isolation and loneliness. The pain of this solitude had driven Stark to split his very soul, creating his current fraction, Lilynette. Then Aizen discovered him, offering membership among the Espada. From that moment forward, he had companions and no longer faced the world alone. For this, he felt genuine gratitude toward Aizen. Previously, Stark had trusted Aizen's assurances completely. He believed that he and his fellow Hollowborn comrades genuinely mattered to their leader. But now, facing such a formidable adversary, Aizen's silence spoke volumes. Though the Espada possessed considerable power, they clearly lacked even the qualifications to serve as effective cannon fodder against whoever commanded such overwhelming Ryatsu. Aizen's indifference to this fact, his failure to issue even basic warnings, revealed that the Lord of Las Noches cared little for their survival. A sense of foreboding settled heavily over Stark. He worried deeply about the future awaiting the Espada. Seeing that Stark had grown even more despondent after her encouragement, Lilynette became increasingly frustrated. The two argued briefly, but with no better options presenting themselves, they could only continue following Aizen's lead, just like the other trembling Espada. They truly had no choice. "I never suspected that the Shinigami possessed such formidable power beyond Aizen himself," Baragon mused within his palace chambers, falling into deep contemplation. He recalled the ancient hollow whose immense form had once blotted out the sun for 3.5 days. That being had invited Baragon to invade Soul Society and assault the Soul King Palace directly, but Baragon had declined. He had been content to remain in Hueco Mundo as its self-proclaimed king. Nevertheless, Baragon would never forget the confident demeanor of that ancient hollow. Later, he learned that this powerful entity had indeed breached Soul Society, defeated Captain Commander Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni, and even launched an assault on the Soul King Palace, after which, nothing more was heard. This history had tempered Baragon's ambitions regarding Soul Society. On one hand, he lacked grand ambitions beyond ruling Hueco Mundo, on the other, he understood that the Shinigami possessed formidable resources that shouldn't be underestimated. But he never expected that while he made no move against the Shinigami, they would eventually come to challenge him. When he had been contentedly sipping his wine and enjoying his status as Emperor of Hueco Mundo, Aizen had appeared at his doorstep and stripped away everything. Chapter 172. And now, another being of power comparable to Aizen had arrived in Hueco Mundo, unleashing Ryatsu with reckless abandon. Arrogant. Truly arrogant. These Shinigami showed such disrespect. What did they think Hueco Mundo was? Their personal playground? Contemplating this indignity, Baragon glared toward Aizen's location, undisguised contempt etched across his ancient features. Although circumstances had forced him to temporarily join the so-called Espada, although these Shinigami possessed strength exceeding his own, although he dared not fight them directly and sought merely to survive, the rebellious spirit within him would never be extinguished. One day, he swore, he would slaughter all these Shinigami invaders, leaving none alive. This was the only path remaining for the former king of Hueco Mundo to preserve what little remained of his dignity. In the Soul King Palace, watching Uehara Shiroa unleash divine power through his Shunkyo Bankai, the sword god Otsunemea spoke with evident confusion. The power of that Zanpakuto simply isn't right, is it? I acknowledge that Shunkyo is formidable, especially its extraordinary spatial manipulation abilities, truly exceptional among all blades. But wielded by someone with a Shinigami's physical limitations, this level of power should be impossible, shouldn't it? As the creator of all Zanpakuto, he shouldn't have needed to ask such questions. After all, he had forged the sword. He could sense the potential of any Zanpakuto with absolute clarity. His experience and knowledge allowed him to accurately gauge any Shinigami's capabilities. Yet Nemea found himself utterly unable to comprehend the relationship between Uehara Shiroa and Shunkyo. This should have been impossible for someone of his stature, a divine swordsmith and member of the Royal Guard. But the impossible had manifested before his eyes. His normally precise understanding was now shrouded in confusion. Hayasuba Chibe, leader of the Zero Division, smiled at his fellow Royal Guard members and remarked, "Young people these days are truly remarkable. Don't you agree?" Privately, he elevated Uehara Shiroa's threat assessment by several levels. Just as the sword god had observed, Shunkyo's power exceeded all reasonable expectations. Moreover, those time-space manipulation abilities represented forbidden knowledge that could potentially destabilize the very foundations of their world. Why would the Soul King permit such power to manifest? Why couldn't the Soul King perceive Uehara Shiroa's future trajectory? Regarding these two questions, Ichibe actually harbored answers within his mind. However, they were definitely not the answers he wished to acknowledge. Although it hasn't yet reached the level requiring the release of the Blood Pact seal, it approaches that threshold uncomfortably, remarked the elegant Senjimara Shutara, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. What astonishing power! I find myself genuinely curious about what secrets he possesses that facilitated growth to such extraordinary levels. Very few individuals in existence could capture her attention. Even fewer could provoke the visible emotional response she now displayed, perhaps none before this moment. The reason was clear. The power demonstrated by Uehara Shiroa had surpassed the established limits of Shinigami capability, approaching the realm occupied by the Royal Guard themselves. The Zero Division's power was so overwhelming that, with the exception of Ichibe, all members had been compelled to bind their true Zanpakuto using the Blood Pact seal. Only upon breaking this seal could they activate Bankai, unleashing power sufficient to shake the foundations of all three realms. This necessity for sealing their Bankai, preventing simultaneous activation, served as a critical safeguard. And yet a mere Shinigami now wielded power approaching their tier. This represented far more than a minor anomaly. Kiryu Hikifune nodded in agreement, adding, "Indeed. This clearly exceeds the level any Shinigami should possess. The Espada and Aizen faced certain defeat." Though none among them had seriously believed Aizen could threaten their position, all acknowledged his exceptional talent and strength. However, Uehara Shiroa's display proved even more astonishing. Aizen's development followed a predictable evolutionary path, remaining within their sphere of understanding. But Shiroa's demonstrated abilities defied explanation through conventional concepts of talent or potential. These troublesome individuals, do they believe the Zero Division doesn't exist? Exclaimed Tenjiro Korinji, his distinctive airplane-shaped head tilting with indignation. His inner thoughts proved more nuanced than his outward demeanor suggested. He had monitored Aizen and the Hogyoku with great attention. He understood that the combination of Hogyoku and Aizen represented genuine danger. Yet paradoxically, this very combination ensured Aizen's ultimate failure. Sometimes when one's fundamental direction is flawed, the stronger one's conviction and the more perfect one's plan appears, the more catastrophic the inevitable downfall becomes. Aizen required only minimal oversight. With Uehara Shiroa present, the likelihood of Aizen's success diminished even further. But this raised a more pressing concern: how might they address the potential threat Uehara Shiroa himself represented? Even the shrewd Ichibe lacked a clear answer to this question. Tanjiro certainly had none. The undeniable reality remained: Uehara Shiroa no longer operated within their sphere of influence. For a disconcerting moment, it seemed as though a god observed them from on high. The Zero Division found themselves in unfamiliar territory, uncertain, with divergent thoughts clouding their normally decisive minds. Feeling the extraordinary fluctuations emanating from Hueco Mundo and studying the remarkable images captured by his monitoring equipment, Keisuke Urahara sank into profound contemplation. The energy intensity registered at levels that defied belief. Were all spatial ability users this overwhelmingly powerful? Uehara Shiroa's strength vastly exceeded his projections. Originally, Urahara had categorized him as a fifth-tier threat, attributing his apparent fearlessness to various strategic calculations. Now he understood, they existed in entirely different atmospheres. Shiroa soared through divine realms, requiring none of the careful maneuvering that more limited beings necessitated. When one possessed nothing to fear, fear itself became irrelevant. This realization rendered Urahara's previously established countermeasures absurd. In retrospect, his careful planning resembled the desperate gambit of a clown performing for an indifferent audience. Beside him, Tessai Tsukabshi couldn't help but exclaim, "Commander Uehara's strength is truly magnificent. Surely Aizen must lose this confrontation." In truth, when Tessai had previously encountered Aizen, he had recognized shadows of Captain Commander Yamamoto Genryusei Shigekuni's overwhelming power. He had initially assumed Uehara Shiroa, though formidable, would prove weaker than both Yamamoto and Aizen. But now, by comparison, Aizen no longer seemed so invincible, he appeared almost ordinary. Even at his peak, Aizen appeared to possess merely a shadow of Uehara Shiroa's capabilities. The reputation of Soul Society's greatest historical prodigy was clearly well-deserved. Urahara sighed deeply and responded, "If only matters were that simple." Aizen represented a significant threat, but Uehara Shiroa embodied something far more unpredictable. His methodologies tended toward extremes. In reality, Shiroa's capacity for ruthlessness exceeded even Aizen's. Wherever he traveled, he eliminated all potential threats without hesitation or mercy. Those who offended Aizen might yet survive; those who crossed Uehara Shiroa were beyond salvation. Even the Soul King could not preserve them. Without appropriate checks and balances, such an individual might reduce the world to ashes. Although Urahara recognized the darkness and corruption pervading their reality, complete demolition and reconstruction struck him as needlessly extreme, inevitably causing unnecessary suffering. Therefore, he preferred maintaining the current imperfect equilibrium. Regardless, isn't this preferable to Aizen's success? Tessai asked, unable to fully comprehend Urahara's concerns. From his perspective, certain individuals deserved their fate. Uehara Shiroa might employ brutal methods, but the Tsuneyashiro family's reign of terror had ended. Chapter 173. Everything about Aizen can be traced, Urahara stated calmly. On the night of the hollowification incident, Aizen could have used Kyoka Suigetsu to erase all evidence of his involvement. However, several captains and vice-captains being hollowified simultaneously created too much upheaval. If the culprit remained undiscovered, Soul Society would maintain heightened vigilance, hindering Aizen's subsequent plans. Therefore, he required a scapegoat. Because of my prior research into hollowification and my selection of Mayuri Kuratsuchi from the Maggot's Nest, the nobles immediately identified me as the perpetrator. All of this fell perfectly within Aizen's calculations. Every step he took was meticulously planned. One could say he had mapped out the entire scenario from beginning to end. In truth, Urahara and Hirako had begun suspecting Aizen long before either side made their move. What they hadn't anticipated was Aizen exploiting their suspicion, turning it against them by setting a counter-trapping and utilizing Kyoka Suigetsu to establish an unassailable alibi. Having recognized Urahara's weakness, Aizen not only silenced them but also ensured that Urahara shouldered complete responsibility for the crimes. At that critical moment, Aizen had left him precious little time or room to maneuver. Urahara had no choice but to save Hirako and the others whose souls were collapsing after their involuntary holification. This desperate action only served to corroborate accusations that he had conducted forbidden holification research, leading Central 46 to issue an execution order. Beyond fleeing Soul Society, they had no alternatives. This escape essentially confirmed their supposed guilt, allowing Aizen to transfer all blame onto them. When Urahara used the Hogyoku to stabilize Shinji Hirako and the others from their precarious condition, he permanently forfeited any possibility of overturning the verdict. By that point, Aizen had secured absolute control of the situation. The enemy could monitor activities throughout the three realms while wielding Kyokusuagetsu as an unbeatable trump card. Urahara's group dared not even show their faces, let alone return to Soul Society. Moreover, Aizen possessed both witnesses and a flawless alibi. Beyond unsubstantiated accusations, they held nothing, leaving them in a hopelessly disadvantaged position. Under such circumstances, they couldn't even dream of testifying against Aizen to clear their names. To further conceal the truth, Central 46 had sealed all information related to the holification incident. The other Shinigami remained ignorant of what truly transpired, unaware that Urahara had identified Aizen as the actual mastermind. Consequently, until Aizen finally revealed his true nature, he maintained an image as pure as a white lotus. 100 years of apparent inaction made Urahara's group appear foolish in retrospect. Urahara still dwelled on that devastating defeat. Over the decades, he had reviewed the circumstances countless times. Through repeated analysis, he had glimpsed the real Aizen hidden behind the illusions of Kyokusuagetsu. Previously, Aizen had operated from the shadows while they remained exposed, explaining their crushing defeat. But now the situation had reversed. They worked from darkness while Aizen stood in the light. This reversal of offensive and defensive positions provided Urahara an opportunity for vindication. Even in worst-case scenarios, Urahara maintained contingency plans. He always retained hidden measures. This represented his true capital. Yet these carefully cultivated advantages proved ineffective against Uehara Shiroha. After witnessing Shiroha demonstrate abilities capable of destabilizing the world order, Urahara realized all his calculations and backup plans seemed trivial and powerless by comparison. This revelation constituted his gravest concern. Should Uehara Shiroha decide to fundamentally alter their world, Urahara could do nothing but watch events unfold. So, Tessai inquired, does Uehara Shiroha also seek the Hogyoku? Are his objectives aligned with Aizen's? The desire for greater power. For transcending Shinigami limitations offered one possible explanation. But if that were the case, what could possibly stop Uehara Shiroha? That's precisely what confuses me, Urahara admitted helplessly. He assists the Shinigami and suppresses the Espada, yet doesn't eliminate them. Despite possessing overwhelming advantages in both power and intelligence, he allows the situation to deteriorate. It's as though all this represents mere entertainment for him. Or perhaps it's because Uehara Shiroha's extraordinary strength certainly provided him the luxury to treat the world as his playground. This appeared to be the case. The man had flaunted his power throughout Hueco Mundo, yet Aizen refrained from direct confrontation. Other factions, including Urahara himself, adopted a wait-and-see approach toward Shiroha. Perhaps to someone like Uehara Shiroha, the world truly represented nothing more than an elaborate stage for his amusement. Could it be that he permitted Aizen to pursue his ambitions simply because the resulting drama proved more entertaining? This thought triggered a flash of insight in Urahara's mind, revealing another possibility. In other words, Aizen is destined for defeat. Barring unforeseen developments, he will fall at what should be his moment of greatest triumph and glory. But why? What gives Uehara Shiroha such certainty that events will unfold precisely this way? In that moment, Urahara felt he understood a fragment of Shiroha's mindset. Yet he couldn't identify the source of the man's confidence and self-assurance. Unless Shiroha could somehow observe everything from a higher dimension, controlling events like a god. Upon his throne in the fifth tower, Aizen unleashed his own Ryatsu, effortlessly countering the spiritual pressure descending from above. The protective range of his power encompassed the entire fifth tower. Areas beyond Aizen's protection had already begun developing cracks and fissures. No matter how resilient the stone, it couldn't withstand attacks that severed space itself. As the Reiatsu impact continued, the massive structure of Las Noches gradually crumbled under the overwhelming pressure. This power demonstrated incredible strength that defied reason. Regarding this development, Aizen merely frowned without comment. Even with Aizen's protection, Jin and Tozen experienced significant strain. When the attack first descended, their hearts had palpitated violently while their heightened spiritual perception registered imminent death. The familiar Reiatsu had surged forward, bypassing spatial limitations and all conventional defenses to strike directly at their souls. Its power exceeded that of an ordinary captain's Bankai. Standard captain-level Bankai releases wouldn't inspire such mortal dread within them. Yet this terrifying assault represented merely a casual attack from Uehara Shiroha. Moreover, this technique simultaneously affected all of Las Noches, impacting every espada concurrently. This level of power seemed outrageous and utterly implausible. Even formidable individuals like Jin Ikamaru and Kaname Tozen found themselves helpless before such an onslaught. Fortunately, Aizen had shielded them from the attack, reducing their exposure to its full force. Jin maintained outward composure, though internally his mind raced at desperate speed, his mental processor nearly overheating from strain. In truth, he felt profound concern for Aizen's position. Uehara Shiroha had demonstrated with a single strike that the espada were effectively inconsequential. Given Shiroha's displayed strength, not only were the espada rendered irrelevant, even he and Tozen seemed equally insignificant. This situation presented extraordinary difficulties. Fortunately, Jin wasn't responsible for strategic decisions or public appearances. The more powerful Uehara Shiroha proved to be, the greater Jin's own opportunities became. Tozen, lacking such complex considerations, spoke directly. "Lord Aizen, is there a method to counter this type of attack? Such power poses significant danger to our forces." Even now, fear lingered in his mind. Tozen's optimal offensive strategy involved utilizing his Bankai, Suzumushi Tsuashiki Enma Kurogi, to deprive enemies of their five senses, plunging them into complete helplessness before methodically destroying them. Yet confronting an attack capable of consuming souls, he recognized that his Bankai amounted to little more than a child's game. Their combined combat potential clearly fell short of what the situation demanded. Thankfully, Lord Aizen could neutralize such attacks with apparent ease. Chapter 174. Aizen shook his head and responded, "I'm afraid defending against such power is nearly impossible, and attempting to do so would be meaningless." What represented a casual display from their opponent already exceeded their maximum capabilities. How could they possibly counter such force? Without being able to discern Uehara Shiroha's true trump cards, Aizen refused to act rashly. Outwardly, he maintained his characteristic calm composure. Just moments ago, he had appeared impressively composed while shielding Tozen and Jin from the attack, but the spiritual cost had been tremendous. A few such attacks had rapidly depleted his Reiatsu, nearly exhausting his reserves completely. Since reaching the pinnacle of Shinigami potential, this marked the first occasion where Aizen experienced this sensation of spiritual bankruptcy. Given his exceptional Reiatsu talent, the difficulty of withstanding these attacks spoke volumes. Anyone else facing Uehara Shiroha's onslaught would be reduced to ash within seconds. Combat between Shinigami ultimately came down to a battle of spiritual pressure. When Reiatsu proved insufficient, one could only compensate through specialized abilities. But when confronting an opponent whose Reiatsu dwarfed your own, whose abilities demonstrated greater lethality, and who operated on an entirely different dimensional plane, what defense remained viable? Beyond personal evolution, Aizen couldn't conceive of any method to counter this devastating technique. The evolutionary path he had chosen was indeed correct. In truth, regardless of its correctness, he had no alternative route available. Aizen had left the espada without choices, and now Uehara Shiroha had similarly backed him into a corner. The sword strike his opponent had just unleashed had effectively severed all Aizen's retreat paths and contingency plans. Now he could only advance forward. Nothing remained except the pursuit of the Soul King's throne. He typically arranged such scenarios for others, never expecting to find himself similarly manipulated. Just as he had orchestrated events for Ichigo Kurosaki, Uehara Shiroha now orchestrated his fate. What profound irony! Jin seized the opportunity to interject. It appears this was merely a demonstration rather than a declaration of war. My old classmate seems to have other designs. Lord Aizen, should we accelerate our timetable? He recognized that Uehara Shiroha was deliberately maneuvering Aizen into a specific position. Although Jin couldn't comprehend how his former classmate had attained such overwhelming power or what his ultimate objective might be, one thing remained obvious: Shiroha didn't consider them serious threats. It seemed all of Aizen's careful planning might already fall within Shiroha's calculations. This realization proved truly terrifying. The pressure now rested squarely on Aizen's shoulders. I understand, Jin, Aizen replied calmly. Uehara Shiroha's existence represents precisely the opportunity one require. When the Hogyoku fully awakens, transformation will follow. The final outcome remains unchanged: ultimate victory will be ours. As he spoke, Aizen's gaze deepened, while internally he reasoned, Uehara Shiroha demonstrates his power so overtly yet leaves me room to maneuver. This suggests everything proceeds according to some design. He clearly harbors profound skepticism regarding my plans. So what will the final result truly be? How genuinely exciting! In the Wandenreich, Yhwach emerged from his initial shock into bewilderment. He believed he had allocated sufficient attention to Uehara Shiroha. Not only had he included this young Shinigami on his list of 6 special war potentials, but he had positioned him as number 1 among them. He had even utilized his newly awakened ability to repeatedly examine Uehara Shiroha's past and future. This represented no simple undertaking. Firstly, his power had not fully regenerated, meaning the Almighty had not completely awakened. Secondly, Uehara Shiroha differed fundamentally from ordinary Shinigami. The past and future of most Shinigami appeared with perfect clarity in Yhwach's vision. But everything surrounding Uehara Shiroha remained frustratingly vague. Until reaching a certain temporal point, beyond which the man's future completely vanished from Yhwach's sight. Despite such difficulties, Yhwach had maintained considerable vigilance regarding Shiroha, though the information he gathered remained disappointingly sparse. Now it seemed his caution toward Uehara Shiroha was justified yet still woefully insufficient. The attack just unleashed in Hueco Mundo possessed enough power to threaten even Yhwach in his current, partially awakened state. With his extraordinary perception and knowledge, he immediately recognized that this attack transcended Shinigami limitations, perhaps even surpassing the boundaries of mortal capability entirely. This defied all logic. Yhwach had always believed such power remained exclusive to gods. Even with the Almighty fully activated, he had only vaguely glimpsed the edges of this realm without fully accessing it. How could Uehara Shiroha possess such power? More perplexing still, this particular Shinigami never appeared to train or strive for improvement, seemingly content with eating, drinking, and pursuing pleasure. In truth, Yhwach had never successfully deciphered Uehara Shiroha's motivations or desires. Initially, he hadn't considered this Shinigami particularly threatening. Though the man possessed extraordinary talent, his character seemed lacking. At that time, Uehara Shiroha had displayed no apparent ambition, exhibiting only appetites for worldly indulgences, rendering him seemingly harmless. He represented an anomaly among Shinigami, apparently lacking both purpose and the dignified bearing typical of truly powerful beings. If not for the fact that Yhwach had previously suffered betrayal, he likely wouldn't have placed such an individual on his watch list at all. His death a millennium ago had taught him to remain cautious, suspicious, and ruthless. When circumstances demanded sacrificing subordinates, one must do so without hesitation, for hesitation inevitably led to defeat. Evidence had subsequently proven Uehara Shiroha far from simple. The man had soon revealed his fangs, adopting increasingly radical methodologies that differed completely from his earlier persona. Judging from recent behavior, Uehara Shiroha demonstrated far greater decisiveness in killing than Yhwach's old rival, Yamamoto Genryusei Shigekuni. One might reasonably describe him as quite the formidable adversary. Possessing ambition and ruthlessness without corresponding strength would present little cause for concern. But who could have anticipated this seemingly unremarkable individual would command such extraordinary power? Clearly, Uehara Shiroa presented a far greater challenge than expected. Combined with the scarcity of reliable intelligence, this opponent had become increasingly difficult to counter effectively. Within the Ice Palace, addressing his assembled guards, Yhwach rendered his judgment. Uehara Shiroa represents a greater threat than anticipated. Fortunately, his interests and soul societies do not fully align. When war begins, we must pay special attention to this enemy. Yes, Your Majesty. Though several guards nodded in agreement, their eyes betrayed lingering disdain and rebelliousness. Their attitude reflected genuine ignorance and fearlessness. Residing within the Wandenreich, they could only sense the residual power of Shunkyo Bankai. This power certainly felt formidable. Indeed, upon careful consideration, it was objectively impressive, yet remained at a level where they could dismissively think, I could achieve similar feats. Unlike Yhwach, they lacked his terrifying insight, failing to recognize the true magnitude of Uehara Shiroa's capabilities. Even if privately experiencing moments of anxiety, this didn't prevent them from holding their heads high with pride. This arrogance and self-confidence had become integrated into their blood and souls. They possessed legitimate reasons for such confidence. Blessed with script abilities and perfected Quincy forms, they feared nothing. Besides, even if Uehara Shiroa possessed extraordinary strength, could he possibly exceed a fully awakened Yhwach? With the blessing of Oswalin, they believed themselves capable of defying death itself, let alone facing mere Shinigami. In truth, they regarded no Shinigami with serious concern, not even the supposedly strongest Captain Commander Yamamoto Genryusei Shigakuni nor the Royal Guard. Chapter 175. In the eyes of the stern Ritter, the only god was Yhwach himself. Before their Quincy King, even the Soul King must yield. If they feared not the Soul King, how could they possibly dread a Shinigami who had risen to prominence merely a century ago? Observing the self-assured expressions of his subordinates, Yhwach couldn't be bothered to correct their misconceptions. To some extent, he didn't truly believe Uehara Shiroa would prove an invincible opponent. Once the Almighty fully reawakened, Yhwach would control the future itself, mastering all possibilities. At that point, it seemed unlikely that Uehara Shiroa could create significant disturbances. Only Hashwalth, the Empire's second-in-command and Yhwach's other half, spoke with genuine candor. Indeed, Uehara Shiroa shows no mercy toward the nobility. He appears profoundly dissatisfied with Soul Society and perhaps this world in its entirety. We might exploit this sentiment to our advantage. This represented perhaps the only positive development. Like his extraordinary strength, Uehara Shiroa's interests, personality, and methodologies defied conventional understanding. Hashwalth sensed this might provide an exploitable opening. Regarding raw power, further contemplation proved unnecessary. None of the assembled stern Ritter could likely defeat this man unless Yhwach employed Oswalin to dramatically enhance their capabilities. Hashwalth cared more deeply for the Wandenreich and the Quincy than anyone present. Consequently, his considerations extended further than the others. The remaining stern Ritter and Yhwach himself continued to wait patiently. They awaited the day they would see the light again, when their thousand-year vigil would transform into the most terrifying power the realms had witnessed. Meanwhile, several Shinigami captains dispatched for rescue operations arrived in Hueco Mundo. They swiftly locked onto their targets Ryatsu and headed toward the battlefield, each experiencing profound shock. Even now, the aftermath of Shunkyo Bankai continued, its terrifying pressure lingering throughout the realm. The strange light suspended above created a magnificent, ever-changing spectacle that contrasted sharply with Hueco Mundo's cold moon. Residual Ryatsu made the very atmosphere tremble. Even Kenpachi Zaraki, with his notoriously dull spiritual sensitivity, could perceive this overwhelming energy, this commanding presence. This Ryatsu projected such intensity that it seemed to declare war upon the world itself. Kenpachi's hand, tightly gripping his nameless Zanpakuto, trembled slightly. Every cell in his body quivered with excitement, rejoicing, practically cheering. His blood-red eyes widened as crimson gold skull-shaped Ryatsu erupted from his form. He laughed with unrestrained delight. It must be Uehara Shiroha. This distinctive Ryatsu lacking murderous intent yet making my hair stand on end, it's exhilarating. There's no mistaking it. This time, I definitely won't let him escape. Hueco Mundo is truly the perfect battleground. Let the carnival begin. Go! Find Kenshan, chirped the pink-haired vice-captain perched on Kenpachi's shoulder, equally excited. She found happiness in Kenpachi's joy. Nothing thrilled them more than encountering an opponent worthy of full-strength combat. While Kenpachi followed his battle instincts toward Uehara Shiroha, Retsu Unohana, Mayuri Kuratsuchi, and Byakuya Kachiki experienced similar astonishment at the residual powers saturating the environment. It seemed as though the entirety of Hueco Mundo had submitted to this overwhelming force. More remarkable still, Uehara Shiroha had achieved this effect with what appeared to be a casual attack. Each captain possessed unique abilities and considerable strength, including the 1,000-year veteran Unohana. Despite their formidable powers, all found themselves stunned by Shiroha's display. Thanks to this lingering spiritual pressure, their rescue operation proceeded with unexpected smoothness. In the original timeline, Rudborn had attempted to prevent Unohana from treating the injured Sato. Byakuya had required significant effort to defeat the recovered Zamari, whose Amor ability presented considerable difficulties. Mayuri had first gathered intelligence before confronting Sailaporo. On this occasion, however, the rescue operation encountered virtually no resistance. Rudborn never appeared. Unohana successfully retrieved and began treating the gravely wounded Sato and the Arrancar Gentenbane. Elsewhere, Rudborn had been thoroughly intimidated by Uehara Shiroha's display. Suddenly understanding the wisdom that the truly insightful man is also a survivor, he hid underground with his Exequias squad, trembling in fear. Unlike the Exequias leader, who recognized the situation's gravity, Zamari and Sailaporo demonstrated less prudence. Both chose to fight to the end, ultimately sacrificing their lives in vain. Zamari Ruros's two greatest strengths were Gemelo Sonido, purportedly the fastest technique among the Espada, and his Amor ability. The former failed to overwhelm Byakuya as Zamari had anticipated, while the latter proved completely ineffective. Consequently, when facing Byakuya, he quickly found himself at a severe disadvantage. Moreover, unlike in the original timeline, Rukia hadn't sustained debilitating injuries that rendered her unable to fight. She retained significant combat capability. Though Byakuya didn't require her assistance, her presence created additional pressure and constraints on Zamari's options. Ultimately, Zamari, having lost his Amor ability, was defeated without suspense. Similarly, Sailaporo's Resurrection abilities had been substantially diminished due to the soul damage inflicted by Shiroha's attack. As a result, Mayuri defeated him with relative ease before methodically collecting his research materials. This represented Mayuri's true purpose in traveling to Hueco Mundo. Sailaporo's research findings and the Arrancar specimens offered immense scientific value. He wouldn't miss such a precious opportunity. The rescue operation proceeded far more smoothly than anticipated. Every captain recognized that this success stemmed directly from Uehara Shiroha's intervention. Though he hadn't physically accompanied them, his influence permeated all of Hueco Mundo, his presence both ubiquitous and intimidating. And he had accomplished all this with a single sword strike. Such strength transcended terrifying, it approached mythical. Rukia, Yuryu, Ichigo, and their companions felt profound gratitude toward Uehara Shiroha. He had, after all, saved their lives. Meanwhile, Grimmjow, having just regained consciousness, found himself questioning his existence once more. He had already harbored insecurities about never defeating Ichigo, though this had only fueled his determination. But witnessing Uehara Shiroha's full-power attack left him momentarily stunned. In his lifetime, Grimmjow believed he might eventually defeat Kurosaki Ichigo, but he couldn't conceive of ever challenging Uehara Shiroha. The gap seemed insurmountable, not merely a difference in degree, but a fundamental distinction like that between mortal and divine. From his perspective, Uehara Shiroha presented an even greater threat than Aizen himself. Ignoring Grimmjow's slightly horrified expression, Uehara Shiroha smiled at Ichigo. "Now you should understand. Strength is simply strength, and combat is combat. The essence of fighting is killing. But fighting itself has no inherent connection to concepts of good or evil. There's no need to feel guilty about your fighting spirit. While speaking, he utilized his observation haki to survey the three realms, confirming the expected calm. This development aligned perfectly with his predictions. As long as his existence posed no direct threat to the schemes of those old foxes, they would conveniently ignore him. Of course, this depended on Uehara Shiroha demonstrating strength that surpassed all living beings. In essence, he could simply recline and observe the drama unfold. Then, when these various players finished baking their metaphorical cake, he could simply enjoy the finished product. "I'll do my best," Ichigo responded, clearly feeling immense pressure. When confronting someone of such overwhelming presence, caution seemed the only reasonable approach. "Is the pressure really that intense?" Uehara Shiroha asked with an amused smile. "You're sweating profusely, little brother. Didn't your teachers ever instruct you on proper etiquette when addressing seniors? Such educational neglect is truly disappointing." "It's not exactly that," Ichigo privately lamented in his thoughts. "Schools don't typically teach protocols for interacting with gods." Chapter 176. When it came to Ichigo Kurosaki, Uehara Shiroha actually found the time to offer him a few pieces of advice. If it had been Prince Naruto or Monkey D. Luffy standing here, he wouldn't have bothered. One of them acted like he'd been hit by Koto Amatsukami, unable to listen to anyone, the other couldn't even read, let alone understand what was being said. Compared to those two, Ichigo Kurosaki was far more lovable, respectful, polite, and soft-hearted. Even if he didn't fully grasp Uehara Shiroha's intentions right now, he would remember them in the back of his mind. A teachable seed, this one. In other words, with just the right amount of manipulation, Ichigo could easily be used to stir up chaos, a prime-grade troublemaker. Meanwhile, Orihime Inoue was eyeing Uehara Shiroha thoughtfully. Her eyes sparkled with surprise, admiration, and even a little gratitude. She understood things that Ichigo didn't, she saw deeper into the implications. But she had no intention of letting Ichigo understand them. Although she felt thankful to Uehara Shiroha and was clearly moved by his overwhelming presence, Orihime was also painfully self-aware. Much like Aizen, Uehara Shiroha was a powerful and dangerous existence. She and Ichigo were no match for someone like him. So while she respected him, a part of her instinctively wanted to keep her distance. "She's pretty sharp," Uehara Shiroha smirked, instantly seeing through Orihime's thoughts. There were still some good women in Bleach, the kind you'd never regret marrying. Take Orihime, for example, sharp, grounded, and sensible. Just like several of his own trusted companions. But Kurosaki Ichigo? He had no core leadership instinct at all. He was too timid. That wouldn't do. Thinking of this, Uehara turned to Ichigo and said with a sigh of disappointment. "I heard your grades are pretty good. And you're still wasting your time on stuff like this late into the night? What a waste of talent. Is school really what you should be focused on? Kurosaki Ichigo, you're not like the others. Don't let studying drag you down." He wasn't just messing with the kid. Ichigo, who carried the blood of 4 powerful lineages, really wasn't like the average person. His ancestry was even more absurd than the Soul King's. In this world where power ruled all, studying was a waste of time for someone like Ichigo. The kid might not be aware of it, but Shiroha could see things clearly. Dreaming of a peaceful life? That's a privilege reserved for the strong. If Ichigo hadn't inherited such a monstrous bloodline, his family would have been wiped out during the very first Hollow attack. This was the reality of the Shinigami world, only the strong survived. The weak didn't even get a chance to play. That was the essence of it. Of course, loving life and sticking to your ideals even after seeing the world's dark side wasn't a bad thing. It just wasn't fun. Uehara preferred seeing others carrying the weight, struggling under pressure, that was far more entertaining than doing all the work himself. Hearing this, Ichigo scratched the back of his head awkwardly and gave a dry laugh, trying to change the subject. "Ahaha, it's not that bad. Anyway, Commander Uehara,
aren't you worried about Aizen and the Espada?
He didn't hold any grudges over Uehara killing Neutra. Ichigo just couldn't bring himself to do something like that, but he wasn't blind to right and wrong. Neutra had it coming.
He just didn't want Uehara dragged into the war because of him.
After all, the man standing before him had never seemed interested in opposing Aizen directly. He always looked like he wanted to stay out of the whole mess.
Who do you think I am? Uehara raised his chin, his tone noble and righteous. I, Uehara Shiroha, will never make peace with Aizen and the Espada.
Even if I have to sacrifice your life and the entire Gotei 13, I'll defeat Aizen completely.
Ichigo blinked.
He still didn't quite get it. He was too young, too naive.
Even if Uehara killed all the Espada by himself, Aizen wouldn't be mad. If anything, it would just prove Uehara's strength. That's why those two future prison bosses Aizen and Yawatch wouldn't dare drag him into their game.
In this world, if you didn't want to be someone else's pawn, you first had to prove you were capable of flipping the board. Then, and only then, would you be qualified to share the prize.
Strength is freedom. Ah!
Ichigo broke out in a cold sweat after hearing Uehara's bold declaration. He was finding it hard to believe the commander wasn't taking the upcoming war seriously at all. To Ichigo, the conflict between Soul Society and Aizen was a world-shaking event.
To Uehara, it was just another round in a game.
At that moment, Uehara Shiroha looked off into the distance, his gaze landing on the shifting white sands.
They're coming.
He smirked.
By the way, is your sword even real? Why do all the hollows in Shinigami you / end up following you around? Did you spike your sword with something? Right, Grimmjow?
From Abarai Renji and Byakuya Kochiki to Grimmjow, and soon, the legendary Eighth himself, Kenpachi Zaraki. They were all weirdly obsessed with Ichigo. It was like a parade of man-crushes.
Kamiju Toma punched people and built a harem. Kurosaki Ichigo slashed people and built a squad of bromantic rivals. Perfect division of labor. That said, Shiroha knew this time was different. Kenpachi Zaraki wasn't coming for Ichigo. First, Ichigo was still injured and recovering, fighting him wouldn't be fun. Second, Shiroha was simply a more exciting opponent.
Ichigo and the others soon sensed the oppressive and terrifying Ryatsu rapidly approaching, feral and overwhelming like a monster unleashed. They looked up instinctively. From the distance, in the shifting white sands, a red-gold figure came charging in like a runaway locomotive. That force, combined with a monstrous Ryatsu, sent chills down their spines. For a moment, they felt like they'd fallen into an icy pit, a blade of spiritual pressure piercing straight through their bodies. It wasn't just killing intent. That Ryatsu felt sharp enough to cut through the air, solid, suffocating.
Amid their confusion, Ichigo and Oraheim found something eerily familiar about that aura. So strong.
Ichigo, Oraheim, Nell, and even Grimmjow, who had just woken up, stared wide-eyed at the oncoming figure. Moments later, a towering man arrived, stepping through the white dunes. He looked like a walking natural disaster, his body radiating wild, murderous energy.
It's him. Kenpachi Zaraki. Ichigo's expression tightened. Relieved for a moment only for dread to take its place again. Sure, Zaraki wasn't an enemy.
But the 11th Division's captain wasn't exactly safe either.
Enemy or ally, if he got bored, he might just start cutting down his own teammates.
Ichigo had learned that the hard way. Oraheim's gaze was filled with worry as she tried healing Ichigo. She knew Kenpachi too well, he wasn't a normal captain. Once that guy got worked up, he'd attack anything that moved. And for some reason, he really enjoyed fighting Ichigo.
The scariest part? He thought of those duels as friendly sparring. Who could survive that? Grimmjow also looked stunned when he recognized the new arrival.
His jaw dropped.
There's another monster? Chapter 177.
The Gotei 13 really was full of monsters. In fact, Uehara Shiroha's earlier jab had accidentally hit a sore spot. After all, he too had been slashed by Kurosaki Ichigo and ended up on the losing side.
Grimmjow didn't appreciate being called out like that. He chose to ignore it, pretending he hadn't heard a thing. Even when facing Aizen, he never played ostrich like this, but Shiroha was something else entirely. Aizen tolerated his antics only because he still had some value. But if he dared raise his voice in front of Shiroha, his head would be flying off before he even finished the sentence. Grimmjow had no doubt about that. Zaraki Kenpachi scanned the group and grinned. Well, well. Ichigo Kurosaki's here too. What a surprise. Hueco Mundo's turning out to be a goldmine. He chuckled, eyes gleaming with excitement. Lie down and recover, Ichigo. I'll take care of Shiroha first. Then you're next. Got that? You're number 19 on the list. For Kenpachi, this was nothing short of a slaughter feast. Uehara Shiroha wasn't his ideal opponent, his ice powers were too tricky and countered Zaraki too well. But without the use of ice, Shiroha was the one opponent he wanted to defeat the most. It had nothing to do with honor, duty, or any sort of higher calling. It was purely for the challenge. Ichigo was also a rare powerhouse, full of surprises. But compared to Shiroha? He was just the little brother tagging along. Their strength levels weren't even close. Not the same league at all. But Kenpachi Zaraki wasn't about to pass up this buy one get one free deal. Two rare opponents. Both worth fighting and both standing right here? This was double happiness. The more, the merrier. As his fighting spirit ignited, Kenpachi's Ryatsu surged like a wildfire. Waves of spiritual pressure rolled off his body in increasingly violent bursts. Nearby, the pink-haired Yuichiro Kusajishi skipped lightly across the battlefield, appearing atop a nearby rock. She stared at her captain with glittering eyes, then turned to Shiroha with a curious grin. She was looking forward to this. In the past, she'd always wondered how Kenpachi would win. Now, she was just curious how long he could last. Pity, really. Her captain usually got tossed around like a ragdoll when it came to this particular matchup. But even that had its charm. Kenpachi enjoyed every second of it. Shiroha had more trump cards than a Vegas casino. The way those deadly techniques kept coming, each more ridiculous than the last, was pure spectacle. Yuichiro Kusajishi wasn't about to miss the show. She wanted blood. Lots of it. Fully fired up, Kenpachi ripped off the eye patch that sealed his Ryatsu without hesitation. Then, gripping his sword with one hand, he launched into a wild slash. He didn't hold back. Not even a little. Facing Shiroha, he knew better than to go easy. His inner seal loosened with excitement, and his Ryatsu exploded outward like a dam breaking. Within moments, it had already surpassed his usual limits. His slashes came crashing down like tsunamis, raw, violent, and devastating. If this were any other opponent, Kenpachi wouldn't have gone full throttle so soon. That would be too boring. He liked to draw things out, feel the tension, taste the opponent's spirit as he wore them down with his blade. But Shiroha wasn't an ordinary opponent. He'd learned that the hard way. In their last bout, he had one, maybe two chances to land a hit. Wait too long, and he'd either get frozen solid or one-shot. He couldn't afford to hesitate. So this time, he went all in right from the start. Golden Ryatsu exploded around him like a rising tide, swallowing everything in its path. His blade flashed with fury like a volcanic eruption, unleashing the wrath of a berserker. Kenpachi's red eyes glowed with madness, his face twisted into a wicked grin. There was nothing in his heart but one thing: destroy the enemy. Every strike came with bone-crushing power. He was a walking hurricane of death. At that moment, Kenpachi Zaraki embodied pure chaos, unstoppable and wild. Uehara Shiroha simply watched him, relaxed as ever. The value of the strongest captain just keeps rising. The 11th Division had long been known for their battle prowess. They were the frontline maniacs, the war junkies who rushed into every skirmish first and came out either bloodied or dead, and they wore that with pride. Injuries? Sacrifice? That was just part of the lifestyle. Because every battle, their captain led from the front.
Kenpachi was always the first into the fray, and somehow, he always won.
That made the 11th Division soldiers idolize him even more.
In fact, they even crowdfunded the title, strongest captain of the Gotei 13. Whether by brute force or reputation, no one else even came close. And right now, standing in front of Ichigo Kurosaki and the others, Kenpachi truly looked the part. His presence, his pressure, his strikes.
Everything screamed dominance.
Especially the golden, skull-like Ryatsu forming around him, solid and terrifying. It struck fear deep into the hearts of those watching. To them, he looked less like a Shinigami and more like a war god.
So much Ryatsu. Oraheim and Nell trembled involuntarily. If Uehara Shiroa's aura made people want to worship him, then Zaraki Kenpachi's aura made people want to run. It wasn't just overwhelming, it was suffocating.
They only felt a small fraction of his power, yet their hands were already cold, their bodies shaking uncontrollably.
This pressure is insane. He's gotten even stronger, Ichigo muttered. He had once fought Kenpachi in a brutal battle for survival.
He remembered the crushing despair, the near-death moments, the overwhelming power that Kenpachi unleashed.
If not for the intervention of Uncle Zangetsu, he might not have survived. And that was the old Kenpachi. This new version? Stronger. Wilder. Scarier.
Ichigo didn't like where this was going. No matter who won, this wasn't going to end well. Now's not the time for infighting, he murmured. But over there, Kenpachi had already leapt forward, blade swinging toward Uehara.
Let's go. Uehara Shiroa didn't mind war-hungry types like him. Actually, he didn't even view Kenpachi Zaraki as a proper person. Even this almost unsealed version? Even if it were Kenpachi in full Bankai mode? Still not worth taking seriously.
Sure, his fighting spirit and sheer force were impressive. He could blast captains aside in base form, split meteorites in Shurkai, and even threaten god-tier beings with his Bankai.
Chapter 178.
In the original plot, among all the captains of the Gotei 13, only Zaraki Kenpachi was truly worthy of inheriting the title of the strongest Shinigami from Yamamoto Genryosei Shigakuni.
But in Uehara Shiroa's eyes? Meh. Not that impressive. First off, that whole adaptive seal thing? Kind of a joke.
Instead of sealing his enemies, Kenpachi essentially sealed himself.
All for the sake of enjoying a good fight.
He unconsciously suppressed his own power, matching his opponent's strength level just to prolong the fun.
It sounded cool, like some edgy warrior trope, but really, it was just dumb.
Put nicely, you could call it walking a different path, being trendy, or keeping it stylish.
Put bluntly? It was the kind of thing people did when they had power but no control over it.
It's like trying to play the pig just to eat the tiger, except you're not pretending to be a pig, you're literally rolling in the mud.
Uehara Shiroa, for example, could one-shot captains without breaking a sweat. But did he go around blasting people like Rukia or Rinji into ash during training sessions? Of course not. Control over one's own strength was basic. The bare minimum.
Day 1 curriculum for the truly powerful.
And with Kenpachi's unsealing speed?
If he faced a top-tier opponent or an explosive glass cannon type, he'd be wiped out before he even had time to react.
Case in point, Kurosaki Ichigo took him down once using that very opening.
To make matters worse, even Kenpachi's Bankai, while undeniably powerful, came with a massive drawback. It tore up his body as much as it did his enemies.
A double-edged sword in every sense.
It was short-lived, unstable, and extremely hard to control. In the end, he had to fight and kill Unohana Retsu, the previous Kenpachi, just to finally unlock his full power.
And the results?
Still just, okay. In Uehara's eyes, Zaraki was a beast with raw talent, but ultimately just a well-fed vegetable. Meanwhile, Uehara himself didn't even need to lift a finger to grow stronger. His system handed him invincible abilities like candy. Just lying down, he'd gain new skills. But even so, he never stopped training.
He mastered every power he received. His techniques were precise. His control was perfect. Every move he used wasn't just overwhelming, it was executed with surgical precision. That was true strength. Kenpachi had a rock-solid foundation, sure. But his power was too brute force, too wild. Like swinging a sledgehammer in a tea shop. He had no finesse, only instinct and raw drive. That might work on most people. His sheer force and monstrous resilience could overwhelm them. But against Uehara? Talent alone just wasn't enough. So when Kenpachi charged in, all fired up and overflowing with battle spirit, Uehara didn't flinch. In fact, he almost laughed. Ichigo Kurosaki and the others, however, weren't nearly as composed. Seeing Kenpachi in full battle mode left them completely stunned. His base Ryatsu was already terrifying, and now it had spiked again. Does this guy even have a limit? Monster. And those slashes? Even watching from a distance made their skin crawl. At this moment, Zaraki's face practically had the words "I am invincible" written across it. Under their shocked gazes, the war god charged straight at Shiroha. And then, the war god was sent flying. To be more precise, Zaraki Kenpachi was smacked across the battlefield like a baseball, hurtling through the air at high speed. Facts didn't lie, Kenpachi was still no match for Uehara Shiroha. Past, present, future, or even alternate timelines, Kenpachi had zero advantage in this matchup. If a regular person faced such a gap in power, getting slapped around, losing every time, seeing no hope of winning, they'd start to break. They'd doubt themselves. Feel frustrated. Eventually, they'd give up the fight altogether. But that's exactly why Kenpachi Zaraki was different. Where others would walk away, Kenpachi would double down. He didn't believe in unbeatable opponents. If one existed, he'd just keep slashing until it broke. That wasn't ego, it was a belief etched into his very soul. The thrill of fighting the impossible. But even that kind of unshakable resolve looked pathetic in front of Uehara's absolute dominance. Because in the face of overwhelming power, belief, no matter how strong, meant nothing. Kenpachi charged in at full force. Shiroha casually sidestepped with a single Tenjin Shuanpa and flicked his wrist in a basic Hakoda strike. Boom! Kenpachi was launched. He hadn't even drawn his sword. It was effortless. Clean. Mockingly elegant. But far from being discouraged, Kenpachi let out a loud, booming laugh as he flew backward. Ha 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 ha. That's the stuff. Despite his injuries, despite being tossed like a ragdoll, he looked even more excited. He didn't back down. He never could. Blood oozed from the corners of his mouth, his body already torn from the impact, but his eyes burned brighter. His killing intent sharpened. His Ryatsu flared up even stronger. His fighting spirit didn't diminish, it amplified. If anything, the pain only pumped him up. His frame seemed to grow, the sheer pressure he exuded rising like a volcano on the verge of eruption. He had entered a new state, complete madness. Destroy. Fight. Bleed. Repeat. Kenpachi, now in full berserker mode, dragged his broken body across the desert and launched himself forward again. A man drenched in blood. A sword raised high. Clang. The golden Ryatsu around him condensed into a violent arc, the impact howling like a tiger's roar through the dunes, splitting the very air apart. Yuchiru's bright eyes sparkled with joy. Kenchan's going crazy again. I love it. She beamed from her perch, clapping her hands like a child watching fireworks. Every single time, Kenpachi would get beaten to a pulp by Shiroha. And every single time, he'd walk away grinning wider than before. Each defeat fueled him. Made him hungrier. Gave him more fire. Fighting was his entire purpose. His reason to exist. No matter how badly he was beaten, he never gave up. Never retreated. Never stopped. Ichigo and the others stood frozen in disbelief. Kenpachi, already unbelievably strong to begin with, had gone all out, and yet, Shiroha crushed him with a single blow. One hit. And still,
the man kept fighting.
And what's worse, his strength actually increased after getting hurt. Monster, Ichigo muttered again, voice hollow. Over on the other side, Shiroa couldn't help but grumble inwardly. What kind of undead vitality is this guy running on? And the more injured he is, the stronger he gets? Are you sure you're a Shinigami and not some RPG boss in rage mode?
That was what made Kenpachi so troublesome. In the Bleach, defeating someone with high Ryatsu wasn't always that hard. The goal was usually to knock them out or overwhelm them enough that they couldn't fight anymore, not necessarily kill them.
Hit them hard enough, and they're done. But actually killing someone with high Ryatsu?
Way harder. That was just how spiritual beings worked. Even in the original timeline, despite all the wars and massive battles, only a handful of well-known Shinigami ever died. Unless someone had overwhelming power or abilities that ignored defense altogether, most fighters just got injured and taken out of the fight.
Take Yamamoto, for instance. After losing just one arm, the strongest Shinigami in history became noticeably weaker.
Or Shiba Ishin, after taking a hit from Aizen and losing part of his strength, he couldn't even activate his Bankai anymore.
Chapter 179.
Though the Vizards possessed the powers of Hollows, they had a major flaw: their durability. Once injured, they were usually out of the fight, making their battlefield presence unreliable at best. Their performance in actual combat had always been subpar.
To Uehara Shiroa, these Shinigami with hollow masks were fragile, not completely worthless, but definitely not impressive.
Kenpachi Zaraki, however, was a different story entirely. He might be the one true exception in the entire Gotei 13.
This guy wasn't just strong, his vitality bordered on inhuman.
His defense was rock solid, and worst of all, the more you beat him up, the stronger he got. It was an ability that didn't sound impressive on paper, but in battle, it was infuriating. You'd cut him down again and again, certain he was about to drop, and then he'd stand up, eyes shining, smile widening, and fight even harder than before.
That kind of relentless spirit was enough to break a person's will.
Even Gremmy Thumos, the so-called strongest of Yawacha's stern Ritter, was overwhelmed by this quality. Despite his reality warping powers, Gremmy still lost to Kenpachi during the 1,000-year Blood War.
Why? Because Kenpachi was the ultimate wildcard.
His power levels fluctuated wildly.
You could never predict what he'd do next. Both Aizen and Yawach were deeply wary of him.
Aizen even went so far as to trap Kenpachi in Hueco Mundo with a carefully laid plan, just to keep him out of the way. Yawach, more methodical, classified Kenpachi as one of the 6 special war powers, tagging him specifically with the label, combat power.
It wasn't just a compliment, it was a warning. Even in terrible condition, Kenpachi could surpass his limits.
The more desperate the situation, the stronger and crazier he became.
Just ask Tozen Kaname.
He thought his Bankai, Suzumushitsu Ashiki, and Makurogi had fully sealed Kenpachi's senses and trapped him in a hopeless situation. Who could have predicted that the one man to ignore all logic would fight on through pure madness and bloodlust, shattering the stalemate with raw strength? Tozen called it impossible.
But Kenpachi made the impossible happen.
It was the ultimate proof of a classic truth. The Berserker is the strongest.
Except that in Uehara Shiroa's world? That was just a joke. A so-called strongest Berserker was still just one poem away from being flattened.
Even Kenpachi Zaraki, invincible in others' eyes, was laughably fragile to him.
Just like last time. Shiroa calmly stepped forward and raised a hand.
With one simple movement, he vanished in a blur of Tenjin Shuunpa.
In the next instant, he was directly in front of Kenpachi Zaraki. Like space itself had bent around him. Then came the palm. A casual, almost lazy strike. But the moment it connected, the air twisted. The Ryatsu surged outward with earth-shattering force.
Kenpachi, mid-swing, had no time to react.
His pupils shrank.
His sword froze.
Then boom, he was sent flying like a rag doll. That absurd Ryatsu of his? It didn't help one bit. That unbreakable body? It was like wet paper under Uehara's palm.
This time, Kenpachi came in fast, but flew out even faster. He slammed into a towering rock pillar, his massive body embedding itself deep into the stone like a human wrecking ball.
And then, silence. No movement.
Just like that, Zaraki Kenpachi, the infamous captain of the 11th Division, had been knocked unconscious like a baby taking a nap. Ichigo Kurosaki gawked in disbelief, staring at the now-still figure stuck in the rock.
Is Kenpachi okay?
His voice was shaken.
This was just a spar, right? Why did it feel like a brutal execution? Weren't they on the same side? And Uehara Shiroha, he was way too strong. This wasn't a fight. It was a one-sided massacre.
No, calling it a fight was already generous.
Who would have thought that the same Kenpachi who once made Ichigo feel completely hopeless would be swatted into a cliff like a mosquito? It was beyond ridiculous. Hearing Ichigo's horrified question, Shiroha just shrugged. Dunno. Maybe he's dead.
His tone was indifferent, as if it wasn't a big deal. To onlookers, it seemed like he'd gone too far, overdone it.
But Shiroha couldn't care less about what others thought.
Kenpachi brought this on himself. If anyone else had dared swing a sword at him, they'd already have a grave overgrown with weeds.
Sure, Shiroha could defeat someone without hurting them. That kind of finesse was nothing for him.
If he wanted to, he could have used his perfected white album to instantly freeze Kenpachi into an ice popsicle and end the battle neatly.
But there was no need. To the average observer, a peaceful ending where no one got hurt would seem ideal. But for someone like Kenpachi? That was hell.
Being frozen powerless, unable to fight, was worse than death for him. People misunderstood the situation because they assumed everyone thought like they did.
But that was the limit of mortal understanding. Because of Kenpachi's unwavering spirit, Shiroha had shown him respect by using his palms instead of freezing him outright. A double palm send-off was already a glorious burial. Most people weren't even worthy of that. And Kenpachi?
He still wasn't worthy of making Uehara draw his sword. Still not enough, Shiroha muttered. Thanks for the workout, Kenpachi.
Thanks, pretty boy.
Kusajishi Yuichiro bowed cheerfully before vanishing in a flash step. She zipped off toward the stone pillar where her beloved captain lay embedded. Just like she expected, the battle had begun in an instant and ended even faster.
Uehara Shiroha truly was an opponent worth getting excited about.
Meanwhile, Nell, who had finally recovered, looked up at the sky with sparkling eyes.
Whoa! That guy flew so high. Her face lit up. Looks fun. Boss, I want to try that next. With both of the strongest fighters flattened like pancakes, this was good news for her. If even monsters like them were no match for Uehara Shiroha, then she'd definitely chosen the right boss to follow. Maybe I can help?
Orihime Inoue offered softly, looking in the direction Kenpachi had flown. Her face was filled with concern. Despite Kenpachi's violent tendencies, she remembered how he'd always pestered Ichigo for duels back in the Soul Society. In her heart, he wasn't a bad person. She just didn't understand why he was so obsessed with challenging Shiroha. Why throw himself into a battle he couldn't possibly win?
It wasn't that Orihime looked down on Kenpachi. It's just that Uehara Shiroha's power wasn't something that could be measured. It was terrifying beyond description on a completely different plane of existence.
When she had first encountered Aizen, Orihime felt as if her very spirit was being crushed. Her Ryatsu nearly collapsed, and even her abilities were suppressed. It was like standing in front of a dragon.
But Shiroha?
He was worse. Just brushing against his presence made her instincts scream in panic.
This was a power that could not be surpassed, an existence beyond all limits. When faced with such power, Orihime couldn't even imagine fighting. There was only one option: run. No matter the reason, one should never become Uehara's enemy.
That truth had burned itself into her mind. Grimmjow fought Ichigo because there was at least a chance, however slim, that he could win.
But Kenpachi? Challenging Shiroa was like a mantis trying to stop a speeding train. Pointless.
She was sure even Kenpachi knew that, but he still chose to fight anyway.
It wasn't a battle, it was suicide. Oraheim couldn't wrap her head around such meaningless persistence. That kind of obsessive competitiveness just didn't make sense. But maybe, that's just what it meant to be a warrior.
She and Nell could only sense how strong Shiroa was, they didn't truly understand it. All they had was a vague concept of his strength.
Awe.
Worship. Fear. Those were the only things they could feel in his presence.
Chapter 180.
This kind of reverence, this awe of overwhelming strength, was something etched into their instincts. Just like lower life forms naturally submitted to higher ones, people like Ichigo and Grimmjow couldn't help but be awestruck by Uehara Shiroa. Only those who had touched true power could even begin to grasp how terrifying Shiroa's movements were, his flash step, his hand-to-hand strikes. And even then, they only barely understood it. To Ichigo, Kurosaki and Grimmjow, Uehara didn't just fight differently, he felt like he existed in another dimension entirely. Zaraki Kenpachi was terrifying. That much was undeniable. His monstrous pressure, his unrelenting spirit, his slashes that split the sky, no ordinary warrior could face him and walk away.
But in Uehara Shiroa's hands? He was like a child. Not just defeated, dismissed. That was what shook them the most. They both understood how powerful Kenpachi was.
They had experienced that pressure firsthand, and neither of them had the confidence to take on a full-powered strike from him head-on.
And yet Uehara had tossed him aside like a broken doll.
But it wasn't just the power that left them stunned.
It was how he did it. Uehara had been so casual, so effortless, like swatting away a fly while sipping tea. There wasn't even a fluctuation in his ryatsu.
Oraheim and Nell couldn't grasp the depth of what had happened, their spiritual perception wasn't developed enough.
But Ichigo and Grimmjow? They saw it.
And they were shaken.
Because they understood Kenpachi.
His strength was within their realm of experience, the kind of power they could imagine and maybe, someday, reach.
But Shiroha? He was beyond that. They couldn't even process how he moved. His footwork wasn't like a Shinigami's Shuunpa or an Arrancar's Sonido. It was something else.
Faster, cleaner, and completely undetectable.
One moment he wasn't there.
The next, he was standing in front of his opponent, arm already extended.
It was like watching a ghost in motion.
If Kenpachi was a wild tiger roaring through the mountains, Uehara was a dragon gliding silently through the clouds, untouchable, unreadable, unreal. Even his strikes were contradictory.
A single palm. It looked light. Gentle, even.
But then came the sound, the visual shockwave. The sudden collapse of Kenpachi's chest. They watched, frozen, as the energy defense around Kenpachi's body shattered in an instant. His torso dented inward, and he was frozen in mid-swing, completely still, just for a moment, like reality had hit pause. That fleeting instant of stillness felt eternal. A palm so fast it seemed slow. So light it carried infinite weight. It broke their understanding of combat and of physics.
The result? Chaos in their senses. Blurred vision. Dizzy spiritual perception. Stars in their eyes and nausea bubbling in their chests. It wasn't just the strike. It was the unknowability of it. Kenpachi's slashes were terrifying, but they made sense. You could see them coming. You could react. Uehara's techniques? You couldn't even process what was happening, much less fight back. How do you resist something you can't understand?
That kind of power, hidden, unfathomable, and casually lethal, was enough to make anyone despair.
Uehara turned his gaze to the still stunned Ichigo and sighed. Look at them, and then look at you. He shook his head with exaggerated disappointment. You're young, but where's the fire? You swing your sword like you're embroidering a pillow. So soft, who's that gonna kill? He didn't even try to soften the blow. You need to stand up. You haven't learned any real techniques, but you've already mastered holding yourself back? What are you doing sealing yourself like that? The truth is, you can try to suppress your instincts all you want, but they don't go away. They're part of you. The more you force them down, the harder they'll bounce back. You keep holding it in, and one day, you're gonna explode in the worst possible way. Uehara's tone sharpened. You don't understand power. Not truly. You don't even deserve that mask. That was the core of Ichigo's problem. He wanted to protect, but didn't want to fight. Didn't want to kill. Didn't want to change. He wanted power without sacrifice, victory without conflict. That, in Uehara's view, was the real taboo. Why is it that the blackened version of someone is always stronger? He asked, half mocking. It's because that version dares to kill. Once the hero starts hesitating, what if I hurt someone? What if I go too far? They're already 3 steps behind. That's how the term Carpet Ichigo came about. In Bleach, there were people who insisted on making their own lives harder. They had power. They had ideals. And yet they chose to not use them. Ichigo Kurosaki. Keisuke Urahara. Even Batman has this disease. Now Uehara was fully in rant mode. Think about it. Bruce Wayne. He's got absurd combat skills, genius intellect, next-level tech, and more money than several countries combined. He's got power in every sense, physical, mental, economic. And yet, somehow, he still can't deal with the Joker. Uehara shook his head in mock disbelief. This guy wears a high-tech batsuit, drives a tank disguised as a car, and spends billions on gadgets, all to play cops and robbers with a dude in clown makeup. In a world where money can move mountains, Bruce Wayne is still too conservative. All that money, and he doesn't just fix Gotham? Why not change the laws, rebuild the system, lift the poor out of the slums? The answer's simple. Because Bruce Wayne is the system. Wayne Enterprises is part of the upper class. The root of Gotham's rot. As long as the old money elite stay untouched, Gotham won't change. The Wayne family benefits from the way things are. Uehara crossed his arms. Batman plays vigilante not to change the world, but to pretend he's not a part of it. The cape, the mask, it's cosplay. It's theater. And the villains? They get it. That's why no one dares expose his identity. If they do, they're not fighting Batman anymore. They're fighting capitalism itself. He smirked. That's when you stop dealing with batarangs and start getting hit by economic blacklists, offshore accounts, and corporate assassins. It's like Lex Luthor with Superman. Sure, he knows Clark Kent is Superman. But he still plays along. Because once the mask is off, the game's over and no one wants to stop playing just yet. That wraps up this part of What If Transmigrated in Bleach World. Thanks so much for listening. As always, new parts drop every 4 days, so be sure to stay tuned. Also check out my Patreon channel for early releases of all the series, where you can find all the series released one day ahead of YouTube. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and please consider supporting the original author as well. See you in the next one.